Chapter 10. At the Funeral Home. I was to spend the rest of my Thursday at the funeral home for the showing. The actual church service and burial would be on Friday. We arrived at the funeral home an hour early for the family's private viewing and some time to pray. Pastor Bob from Grace Brethren Church would share a message on Thursday, and my pastor, Mike, would lead the Friday service. Marky had attended both churches, and his mother and his friends occasionally joined him at the Brethren Church. Pastor Bob graciously let us use his church because of the large turnout that was expected. Marky's body looked quite different from when I had last seen him in the coroner's building. He actually looked better in those moments I was with him immediately after his death. As I looked at him now, I felt even more strongly that the view of corpses is a morbid tradition. After all, I believe that our earthly bodies are simply a vessel to hold our soul and spirit, so that was not my son lying there. Marky was alive in heaven, living his new chapter of eternal life abundantly. I went near the casket only to encourage those who were hurting. Marky was a popular student at Barberton High School. He was kind, funny, and quick-witted, and he was an amazing athlete. From the time we founded the street ministry, he passed out T-shirts designed by my dad with great artwork of a Spanish mission and John 3:16 on the back to his public school classmates. At first he was chided and students made fun of him. One of his friends later told me that some had called him Jesus Boy and Jesus Freak. The name-calling didn't bother Marky, and he really did love Jesus. The name-calling stopped, but Marky's love for Christ did not. During the 8 years that Marky handed out those 2,000 shirts, most of his friends and classmates received 1 or 2. It was Marky's quiet way of sharing Christ. Given who Marky was, I guess I shouldn't have been surprised that the funeral service had one of the largest turnouts in the long history of the town and funeral home. An estimated 1,500 to 2,000 people attended both services. I spent the majority of the time being an encourager to the people who lined up in the parking lot and waited for 3 hours to pay their respects to Marky. On occasion, a fellow believer would be next in line, and I could rest for a moment. That brother or sister in the Lord would encourage me, and I could hear from them much-needed words of hope. Most of the time I had the peace Jesus promised, John 14:27, but I could tell by the looks on the visitors' faces how they were grieving, and whether a person was a believer, an unbeliever, or someone not quite sure. The shock, pain, and fear of death written on the faces of the unbelievers was very intense. The vast majority of the young people, as well as the adults, were fearful, afraid, and in deep pain. My daughter Carly, however, was an amazing pillar of strength as she greeted friends and classmates one at a time. She had the strength of a mature, godly woman, strength far beyond her 16 years. I could hear her repeat the same truth over and over, and her smile was radiant as she spoke. I will be with Marky in heaven one day. He's not here. He's alive, and he's in no more pain. I know he's with Jesus. We were a very hurting family, but I will always remember Carly's amazing courage and the warm love she showed each and every person as that never-ending line of people passed by the casket that stood only a few feet away from my daughter. Carly's strength gave me strength. Marky's mother struggled and experienced every level of grief imaginable. There were times, though, when she tried to laugh and when she was an encourager, but most of the time she could not speak at all. As always, my wife, Dina, was a rock, there for me every minute of those difficult days. She has the strength of 1,000 men and does not waver. As a result of her rearing, and because she is her mother's daughter, Dina has faith that moves mountains. My 10-year-old daughter, Brooke, had the hardest time at the funeral home. Unable to stand in the receiving line, she spent most of the time in the arms of her mother and grandparents. Dominic and Juliana stayed off to the side with Brooke much of the time. It was a long, arduous night. The young people, and most of those attending were Marky's friends and peers, were the ones who most needed help and encouragement. One day their friend was here, and the next he was not. Their loss of Marky was compounded by the death of their other classmate just a few days earlier. The reality of death and the question of where they would spend eternity were staring them in the face. By his grace, though, The Lord had prepared me to be a sanctuary and a witness for these folks. I was to be a safe place for these hurting people, a place where they could gain strength from my God-given strength. They also gained hope from my God-given hope. They were encouraged because I was encouraged by my Lord and His victory over sin and death. I laughed with them and I cried with them, one at a time, for over 3 straight hours that evening. I handed out to his 20 or so baseball buddies an action photo that had Philippians 4:13 written on it, of Mark Jr. hitting a baseball. I then handed out several hundred more over the next several days, and that image has come to play a big part of our ministry. Nearly 10,000 of these photos have been given away as inspirational posters, all to the glory of Christ. The next day's services at church and then at the burial site will be the toughest, I thought. But I knew God had a plan, and I was seeking Him mightily.